Today I want to welcome Hanna Basel, who is a licensed therapist here in Portland, Oregon, and also in Minnesota. She specializes in couples and trauma and has been practicing since 2010. Thank you so much, Hanna, for coming today.
Happy to be here.
You're a couples therapist who is currently practicing both in Portland, Oregon, and in Minnesota, and you've been practicing for a while. Can you share a little bit about how your own journey supported your pursuit in supporting couples?
Absolutely. So I grew up living a very nomadic lifestyle, which means that it was kind of hard for me to make and maintain long-term friendships. And I also had a mom that was very anxious and overwhelmed, and a dad that tended to be kind of emotionally withdrawn for plenty of their own good reasons. But what that built for me was a pretty rocky foundation for relationships. So relationships were really hard for me. And part of that led me to addiction in my teens. And by the age of 25, I got sober after a few treatment centers. But part of what I wanted to really understand more was why relationships were so hard for me and how to be in one, how to have them. And so I, pursued that both personally and academically. I studied in grad school, and I've found myself working with couples. Actually, I found myself working with couples because I'm actually a certified sex therapist. And so I started working with couples via sex therapy, but then I started to really see trauma coming up. And I started to kind of combine sex therapy, emotionally focused therapy, and just all of my trauma learning and experience. And I absolutely love working with couples.
I can feel that. I do have a follow-up question, though, regarding, your own journey with, pursuing sobriety and all of that. There is this conversation around addiction being sort of a substitute for connection. And I'm wondering if you have any words or if you find that relatable.
Oh, I completely find that relatable. And I think it is. I think, I do think addiction is one of the symptoms of trauma, too. And trauma is so relational, right? Trauma often has to do with viewing ourselves as inadequate or unlovable or being hurt by those that we love. And so we're seeking kind of a safe place to find that, and we often find relief in a substance or, in a video game or in food or whatever it is.
Well, I can imagine, too, that substances can feel reliable.
Yes, yes. I love the way you put that because it's so true.
Yeah.
It gives you a different kind of confidence.
Sure, and then you have to break up with it.
Yeah, yeah.
That's rough. Can you talk a little bit about how childhood trauma thematically shows up in adult relationships?
Yeah, so childhood trauma, I would say, shows up on many dimensions. And so that's kind of where it can become really overwhelming because it shows up physically, it shows up emotionally, it shows up in our relationships, both with ourselves and others. And it shows up, like we're talking about, it shows up as depression, suicidality, addiction. It's just so pervasive in the ways that it can show up. But how it shows up for me in my line of work a lot of the times is viewing yourself as unlovable and also viewing others as dangerous. And so we can imagine how that impacts relationships if you see yourself as unlovable or bad, and then you also see other people as untrustworthy, right? We can all imagine what that would be like.
Yeah, it kind of puts you in a catch-22 where you want connection and you crave being loved, and then it's scary to do so. There's no real solution.
Yes, yeah. I often talk about the dilemma that people find themselves in because we're wired to love, right? We all kind of have that in us, although some of us have disowned it along the way. It's there somewhere. That's my belief. And so, yeah, how do we get that but also maintain safety?
How would you support your clients in navigating these difficulties and challenges that come out of their history that they bring into their relationships?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question because there's so many different things that we do and that we're juggling in session when two people show up, two people with history and emotion and different ways of protecting themselves. And so there are a lot of different things that I use, all with the goal of creating a relationship of recovery, with a relationship where people can heal together and grow together. And so some of the things that I do a lot of is empathic reflection, which kind of sounds like, oh, right, empathy and reflection, no big deal, but it actually really is. A lot of people haven't had anyone reflect their inner worlds to them before in an empathetic way. Also, I love there's a saying, I think it's Carl Rogers, who says, reflection is revelation. And so it's a way that I hold people by seeing them and reflecting them and helping them see each other in session. I work a lot towards de-escalation, and so I do that with pace, going slowly. I help walk people into their emotional worlds, which, as we all know, I think we all know, that can be scary for anyone. But then if you've experienced trauma, it's so much more scary, right? Because usually what's inside is chaotic. And it's really hard to go towards those places. Most of us have been taught not to. And so I help people walk into those places slowly with me there. And I'm often the co-regulator at first before the partner can be the co-regulator. And there's lots of different things that we do depending on what shows up. But I'm first usually trying to understand people's stories and then help them find a story that they can both live in together. And that's usually reflecting the system that's in the relationship, what's happening, right? We can't often see it when we're in it. And so standing back and helping them see, when you do this, your partner does this, and when your partner does this, you do this. Wow, and really what's underneath is you're really afraid, and you don't want your partner to leave, and you want to know they love you, and you're really afraid of being inadequate and not enough, right? And underneath are these vulnerable things going on, but they come out in such confusing ways sometimes.
I can imagine too with couples that, well, first of all, it's really scary to enter couples therapy because your partner is a witness to like the revelation of the chaos that you're describing. Yeah. I can imagine that takes a lot of courage. And then if there are these undercurrents of trauma too that people are bringing into the room that you're already working with. Well, that's not the right word. You're already working with complicated attachment systems. Mm-hmm. So I can imagine when you bring all of that into the room that you have to navigate. Well, there's a lot to navigate emotionally, including fear of exposure and then fear of the attachment components that come up in the context of therapy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it can feel very chaotic in session as well. And so that's part of my job is to organize. Part of my job is to kind of organize the emotion, distill it, understand it in a way. And I come from a belief that everything people do is happening for a good reason, but we have to figure out what that is. So when I see defenses show up, when I see someone really angry or hurt or maybe not being that kind to their partner, I'm going to try and understand why. I'm also going to try and pause that behavior so there's no more hurt. But first, I'm going to understand why as well.
You must have to be pretty assertive.
Yes. Yeah, you do. You have to, the kind of therapy, I think there's many different kinds of couples therapy, but I am an involved and engaged couples therapist. I don't sit back and let people talk because that's not going to help them. They know how to do that. What I want to do is help them have a new, different experience. And to do that, I have to be kind of like a traffic cop sometimes, a really loving traffic cop. That's right, like that's trying to let you know I'm just trying to keep you safe here, right?
How would you say you specifically support partners of trauma survivors in the context of romantic relationships? Like if one partner comes into it with a history and the other one doesn't, I can imagine that's a little bit complicated.
Yes, it is. And often that can show up as actually a pretty common dynamic, which maybe the more traumatized person is more dysregulated. And the more dysregulated they get, oftentimes the more shut down their partner gets in an attempt to feel safer or to restore some sort of homeostasis to the relationship. But then that increases the panic. And so that is a really common dynamic. And so the first thing I think is kind of normalizing that, right? and helping them understand, helping them reflect. So what I do there is I will kind of weave how trauma is showing up in their relationship. And I'll help, that's kind of what I'll start to reflect. I'll say, oh, wow, you do this because, right, when this happened so long ago, that's what you learned how to do. That's the only way you had to protect yourself, right? So I'm helping them see what they do, and I'm helping their partners see what they do, again, from a more compassionate place. And that doesn't mean we don't want to change it, but we want to make sense of it, right? And we want to say, like, you had to do that. So that's why that's happening now. Right? And it's not working for you. So let's help you find something different, some more flexibility. But, there's good reason why people are doing what they're doing. And then I think, another thing that is important to do is to help the partner also recognize that their needs matter, the partner that's not traumatized. Because oftentimes the trauma feels so big that they just start to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so we have to find a balance. And we do that by getting to the point of de-escalation first in a relationship. So first, I'm going to start to strengthen their bond so that they can talk to each other more. And once our bond is stronger, and once our emotions are a little bit more de-escalated, we can have different sort of conversations outside of triggered moments about what both partners need. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I can imagine too that for let's say that a traumatized partner within the couple comes to the table with a history, and then what happens when you're activated is the view of the world becomes totally different, and then the partner is like, hey, it's still me, and something like that. What's going on here? So how do you navigate that? Sort of validating the consequences of trauma, but still helping both partners within the relationship be rooted in the present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that example because oftentimes, the partner does become the villain. And that actually increases the distress, right? To see what was your partner as your enemy all of a sudden is so confusing for both people. And so the way that I would work with that is, again, I'm going to step back and I'm going to try and reflect what's happening. I'm going to hold up a mirror. And so I might say, wow, so your partner is just saying that they're really, worried about not being good enough for you and not being able to give you everything you need. It sounds like you're so important to them. And then I think I just saw you kind of get really kind of angry. I think I just saw some tension happen in your body. And can we notice that? Is that what's happening inside of you? So first I'm going to help them notice what they're experiencing. And I'm going to help them put words to that, right? Without taking away, without trying to change it. And then we're going to try and, again, understand why that's happening. Why is it hard for someone that's been so traumatized to take in love, right? To trust. There's usually, again, a lot of good reasons. So we want to be able to name those. Through doing that, the more that I engage with the emotion and organize it, the more contained it gets. Yeah. So I want to meet the emotion. I don't want to try and get rid of it. And then we start to see it shrink, and we can have different conversations.
Yeah, so you start by understanding the why behind the what. And then in doing so, that already sort of lays a foundation of safety for both partners.
Yes.
Yeah, got it. Relationships can be challenging for survivors of childhood trauma in that they can both, adult relationships for these folks can both be healing and threatening at the same time, which you've reflected already. But can you talk a little bit more about how this specifically shows up in how clients tend to manage it?
So, and I think it's important to say, like, relationships are hard even if you haven't had trauma. Right? I mean, relationships are hard. I don't think we say that enough in this culture, in this world. I think we should be normalizing that. And then you bring in trauma. And of course, it's so much harder. And so how do I navigate both someone being safe and someone being scary? That there's kind of a term for that, which is fearful avoidant attachment. And so it's hard to work with, right? So I'm not going to work on them changing that dynamic, I'm actually going to work on me creating safety with the person that is more dysregulated, that I'm going to be a surrogate attachment figure first.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Because that's what was needed, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, in order to see things clearly, we have to feel safe. And in order to be open to new experiences, we have to feel safe. And it makes good sense, again, that people don't have a template. They don't have a place to put love in when they haven't experienced it. It is scary.
It's also scary if you experience love and then you anticipate loss.
Yes, completely. And that's happened so many times. That's such a form of trauma that we see all the time.
And what about intimacy? How does trauma show up in relationships within the realm of intimacy?
So I consider myself an emotion first, sex second therapist. And so there's a lot of different ways people kind of see this. But the way that it shows up is, of course, that people sometimes need higher safety needs. They have higher safety needs around this, especially if we're talking about sexual abuse. The other thing is that I often talk about maybe the destination is different, right? And we have to figure out what the destination is for this couple. Not what we think intimacy should look like, but what can it look like given what's happened. And it's going to go slower. We're going to work on safety in the relationship first before we try and work with intimacy. But the way it can look is that sometimes people will have very low desire or no desire at all. People can be really triggered. People can also just kind of dissociate a lot during sex. It can look like, being very startled by it. So it can look many different ways.
Yeah, and I'm wondering too, when we talk about sexual abuse specifically, I think that there's an automatic assumption that the partner that experienced that is going to be a female partner. And in, a partner with a male and a female, I wonder if conversations come up around men and sexual abuse, men who have experienced it in childhood too, and if that shows up differently.
That's a great question. Let me think about that for a second. I actually haven't seen a ton of men show up with sexual abuse. And that doesn't mean that they haven't been sexually abused, as we know, but it often isn't talked about. When I was doing individual therapy, I saw that more often and I worked with that. But in couples therapy, I haven't seen that as much. But I imagine we know it's there. I do see often it is the female partner, and we know that that's statistically,
yeah,
exactly
right. I guess sometimes I think about that culturally, especially in traditional relationships, things are obviously changing, and there's a lot of ways to be in love. But in traditional relationships, we're sort of given a script. About especially around intimacy and what that's supposed to look like. And sometimes I think about that as sort of a form of cultural sexual abuse, and that, we're supposed to behave this way, and we're supposed to, women are supposed to, there are a lot of supposed to's around sexuality for women, but also for men that we don't talk about that much either. And I wonder how or if that comes into play when you're doing this work, that we're sort of trying to descript ourselves from the rules we've been given that aren't working in terms of intimacy or even just other components of the relationship.
Yeah, so a lot of times this comes up when people have been trying to live by these scripts, and it's been creating a lot of pain. Because I think you're right. We do come in with these scripts, and a lot of us try to abide by them, and we think it's what we need to do, and that's what will make a relationship work. But then we see all of a sudden the relationship still isn't working, right? And I see a lot of partners that are trying to conform and have different expectations of what intimacy should look like in their relationship, and then start to believe that there's a major problem in their relationship because of the lack of intimacy. So, it's again, this is a complicated subject because I tend to see complications or difficulties with intimacy as, what word am I looking for? As a kind of consequence of the relationship not feeling safe. So I'm trying to think about what your question was again. Sorry.
No, it's okay. It was more about the scripts that we come into therapy with or into our relationships with, and then how that impacts. In my mind, when I asked the question, it was mostly about sexual intimacy, because there's a lot going on in that arena. So I was just kind of curious if you see how those scripts might influence intimacy and connection.
Yeah, thank you for helping me kind of get footed there. So I do. One of the most common ones that I come in with is the female partner feeling like she needs to be sexual with her partner in order to get the emotional bond that she wants, and then growing resentment because of this dynamic. And so that is a script that comes in a lot and can do a lot of damage because the resentment grows. And oftentimes the male partner then is also seen as villainized again and feels misunderstood because intimacy and sex is one of the only safe ways men know how to seek connection. And so I think that it's very complicated and difficult because that's an approved way for men to say, I need closeness. Right? They don't have a lot of approved ways to say, I need closeness.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's so, when you say it like that, that's just kind of heartbreaking. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But also, if sex is viewed as a commodity within a relationship or a contingency, like if I'm intimate with you, then I get emotional connection, then I can imagine there's some fragility under that, maybe from the perspective of both partners, that I have to give this or get this in order for this to work.
Yeah, yes. And I love that you're reflecting that because it is both partners. It is kind of the male partner oftentimes, and again, the gender is not always the same, but oftentimes it is the male partner feeling like he can't do enough too emotionally in order to get the intimacy he wants, right? And so there's resentment on his side that builds up, and then there's the resentment on the female partner's side that builds up because she feels like she has to give the intimacy and enough intimacy in order to get the emotional connection she wants.
And what about non-traditional partnerships? Do you work with LGBTQI plus folks? And if so, are there patterns that you're seeing that are different or the same? Or like, how does being in a marginalized group affect intimacy, for example?
Yeah, so I definitely work with LGBTQIA folks, and I love it. Oftentimes there's a different kind of self-awareness because they have been marginalized. There's a different sense of a relationship with their emotions. And so I really appreciate that in working with marginalized populations. Also, people of color kind of come in with some of the same kind of, they've done more self-reflection. And unfortunately, they've had to do that a lot to kind of figure out how to stay safe. But in terms of working with it, I would say I don't work differently. The same patterns show up. And really what I'm working with is patterns in relationships. And again, the why might be a little bit different because, of course, marginalization can be a form of trauma. And when that shows up, the patterns do look a little bit different and change, but they still are similar patterns.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah. Working in patterns.
Yes.
That makes sense. Trauma you reflected this earlier on in the interview about how trauma affects the way we view ourselves and, of course, the way we view the world and others around us. Can you talk a little bit about how to navigate trauma triggers in the context of intimacy or relationships?
Yeah. So I guess it's kind of like, am I navigating them in session or out of session? You know, and are we talking about how I help couples navigate, or how I hope that couples can navigate outside of session?
I think maybe both.
Okay. So if I were to be navigating it in session, I'm going to put myself in the middle of what's happening. I'm going to slow it down, and I'm going to work with whoever was triggered first. And whoever is more triggered. If both people are triggered, which happens, I'm going to let this person know I'm coming for them. I'm coming for you. I see you. And I just need to go over here for a second and spend some time with your partner so that we can all be here together. So then I'll go to the partner that is triggered, right? And I'm usually going to just start by validating what's happening. Like, that was really scary, or it makes sense that you're angry, right? And usually by now I know a little bit about what's happening. And even if I don't know a little bit, again, I come from a place where I can kind of guess why I'm seeing a trigger here. And so we're going to validate it first. And through validating it, someone can start to feel a little bit more regulated because someone is seeing what they're seeing. And then as they become a little bit more regulated, we can talk about what happened and organize it more. So we can understand, oh, when your partner rolled their eyes over there, that really sent you into a place of fear that you're not getting it right. And then when you get really afraid, that kind of comes out as anger, right? And then your anger kind of starts to get so big, and you see your partner over there and they're not looking at you, and it just starts to build and build and build. And so I'm going to, again, make sense of it, which is probably like I'm repeating that way too much, but it's new and different for couples to do that, actually. And then I'm going to work to use it as a corrective emotional experience. So I'm going to work to take what happened, which it's going to take a little bit of time, right? We have to get to a place where there is a feeling of emotional stability in the room. And it might not be this session. It might be next session. And then I'm going to help one partner share that with the other partner in a new and different way, in a way that is vulnerable.
And that's where the present kind of cures the past in the context of relationships.
Love that you're saying that. I work mostly present process because the past comes alive in the present.
So you work with people in relationships who are ethically non-monogamous. Can you talk a little bit about how that shows up in the room and how you work with it?
Yeah, so I would say it shows up in the room as oftentimes the structure of the relationship is the trigger, and what's happening in the structure of the relationship is the trigger, because we're really trying to move towards the same goal of having a safe relationship where both people can reach and respond to one another. And then we put in kind of an external person or people. It just really gets more complicated. It takes longer. And I would say it's just more challenging. The more people you add, the more challenging it's going to get, right?
Going back to relationships being difficult, yeah, the more relationships there are,
exactly.
The more there is to work with.
Exactly. And so it's not like there's anything wrong with that structure, but I think we do have to recognize, the more people, the more challenging, right? And for some people, I do see a dynamic a lot of the time where people have moved into open relationships as a means of saving what they have as well, which is very tricky, and is something that I don't think works very well.
What does work in terms of motivation and, whatever is prompting the decision to open the relationship and bring in new partners?
I think it has to do with value system, and also kind of value system and how you see the world, the kind of relationship that you want, more high level, right? Like, we all want maybe relationships to look, some of us the same, some of us different. And for some people, they want a lot of freedom in their relationship, or they want the kind of relationship where there isn't a ton of structure to it. Sometimes they do want structure, but they still want a sense of kind of that monogamy can feel confining for people. And it can feel too heteronormative. It can feel too traditional. And so it's a way for them to have some freedom in figuring out what they want their relationship to look like.
Yeah, and I think obviously there's more room for that in the world today, to find love in a variety of ways. What else did I want to ask you? Oh, I did want to go back to something that you said. You were talking about validation. And I think a lot about validation because it's something that is theoretically so simple and de-escalating, but we have such a hard time doing it culturally and in relationships. And I'm wondering if you have any insight as to what the risk might be in validating. Like what's that resistance about?
I love that question. And I think we should talk about that more. I think oftentimes there's a couple of different things happening. But one of the common ones I think is that it feels like you're saying you're wrong if you validate your partner. And so it's really, I have to work a lot with helping people understand that validation isn't saying you're right, it's saying you understand, right? And that you can validate and still disagree, right? And you can also look for parts that you can validate, right? Maybe you don't validate the external behavior, but you validate the internal feelings in your partner. And so I think that that's a big part of it. And people want to be right. And there's a sense that if I validate you, my pain won't be seen.
Yeah, that's well stated. Yeah, the risk is becoming invisible or incorrect.
Yeah. And I think, I experienced that in my relationship, that it can be hard to validate, right? And then feel like, but can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
right. I think that's human. And so again, we have to slow down and make room for all of it.
Trauma is an experience. And we can talk ourselves out of however we experience an experience, but really a new experience is what can offer a shift. Yes. But there's this sort of catch-22 if you have experienced trauma, that you don't want to put yourself in the position of repeating the past. So there are these barriers that come into play that interfere with our ability to absorb, like you were saying earlier, love or connection when it's there, etc. So I could imagine in the context of relational work that you're going to have to first deal with some of the barriers that are in the way of that connection and the corrective experience.
Yeah, I would say that's 50% of time in session is navigating defenses. And so I have to expect those to come up because we're working with humans and humans that have been hurt. So yes, completely, that defenses are showing up because I'm asking people to do really scary things. Right? I'm asking them to talk about their inner world. I'm asking them to share it with one another, to share it with me, right? And I'm still somewhat a stranger. And so definitely defenses come up, and we have ways of working with them.
Which requires a really unique skill as a couples therapist. So how does one navigate taking ownership of their own healing while also making room for new relational experiences?
So I would say that taking ownership is a little bit further down the line in the process. So first, it's can you see what's happening in the relationship? Then it's can you see your behavior? Can you see your action tendencies? And so that's kind of the second step. First, I've gotten them to see it's a systemic problem. So it's not something wrong with you. It's not something wrong with you. It's a systemic problem. Now let's look at what's happening in the system. That's a little bit easier to see how you're showing up in the system at the same time as how your partner is showing up in the system and holding it all together. People have an easier time at kind of being able to see themselves and see what they do. And we're also wrapping it in understanding, validation, empathic reflection, I wrap it in that so that when I'm holding up the mirror, again, I'm holding it up with love.
You know, Unspoken is the name of our podcast. And for me, what matters, what's behind the name is that, you know, a lot of the things that are not discussed are some of the most important things to discuss in the world. And also that which goes unspoken, you know, such as, or if we don't speak about certain things like childhood sexual abuse, for example, or other forms of trauma and its effects on our relationships or who we are, etc. By not speaking, we're also doing nothing, and we're also giving permission for continuance. So for me, that's what unspoken means. And I'm curious, when you hear the word, what does it mean to you?
Well, I love everything you just said. And unspoken, I would say I really resonate with what you said. Unspoken means, it's the things that we're avoiding, and the more we avoid, the more we avoid. And I can't remember exactly how you put it, but there's a way that if we don't talk about it, we leave people with it. And we're not even giving them the opportunity to have new experiences. So unspoken is a powerful word and a great word for a podcast.